From the very beginning, classical liberalism was a philosophy that was on the offensive, that took the initiative, that considered itself in a crusade on behalf of its ideals. Sometimes it's only possible to get a sense of this from the culture that classical liberalism produced. If you think of maybe some of the symphonies of Beethoven, who considered himself a liberal, and the energy, the dynamism that is involved there, or the operas of Verdi, another liberal, the same kind of feeling. It was a very aggressive philosophy. It was a combative philosophy. Among other things, the classical liberals felt that they were in a battle on behalf not only of the majority of people, of the great majority of people in society, but specifically of the producing classes in society. The business people, the working people, professional people, against those classes of society that they viewed as parasitic. And the criterion of parasitism was whether they belonged to the established status quo order, aristocrats, members of the military caste, state priests, and in this way derived their support, their subsistence, from some corrupt state privilege. This idea that they were fighting on behalf of the producers, of those who had a right to their income, against those who did not, comes out again and again in the classical liberal tradition. The classical liberal tradition is not essentially a tradition of harmony of all current social interests. It's the harmony of all members of society under a condition of justice. But they were quite aware that their own society contained strong elements of injustice. I could quote from European authors, as I have been doing for the most part, but I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this is, now George in his lectures will make this much more specific, but this is an American tradition also. There's a great book, a really terrific book, put out by Liberty Press. Now, if you don't know Liberty Press in Indianapolis, then you ought to. They have they're part of the Liberty Fund, and they have something in their endowment which mandates that they lose a lot of money with every book that they publish and sell. So, they put out a book like this. This is Democratic, with a K at the end, editorials. And it's a collection of writings by an American writer named William Leggett. And it was gotten together by a friend of the Cato Institute, a young Austrian economist at New York University, Larry White. Leggett was a man who wrote in the 1830s, and he wrote for the New York Post, which was a non-Murdoch newspaper in those days. And the position that he represented in these hard-hitting editorials is the old Jeffersonian position in American politics. As he put it in one writing, the sum of a good government as described by the illustrious champion of democracy, Jefferson, is all we aim at, a wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. But Leggett, in his own mind, was aware that in his day, that was back in the 1830s, there were definitely people who were acting in the position of the European aristocrats now in the United States. He has an editorial that Larry put in here called The Street of Palaces. By the way, what I wanted to say about this is that this book in paperback is, I think, $6 or something. And in hardcover even, it's about $8 or $9. It's a very good buy. And he talks about the Street of Palaces. He says in Genoa, in Italy, there's a famous street of palaces. And the traveler may go there and see the grandeur of the ancient aristocrats of Genoa. But it occurs to him, have we not too our privileged orders in America? Our scrip nobility, that is banks that are permitted by the government to put out paper, unredeemable by gold, and have it treated as money. Notice he's not talking about some kind of socialist threat, so-called, but again, the threat to his free order of equal rights, his Jeffersonian democracy, this threat coming from privileged capitalists. You might say the Lee Iacocca's of his time. Our scrip nobility, aristocrats clothed with special immunities who control indirectly but certainly the political power of the state, monopolize the most copious sorts of pecuniary profit, and wring the very crust from the hard hand of toil. And he says, yes, we have such a street. It is called Wall Street, where the bankers of his time, the privileged state bankers, lived. So that Leggett is a very good example of a hard-hitting, crusading liberal of the early 19th century. Very much like the levelers I talked about this morning, or Tom Paine, or the British radicals, or afterwards Cobden and Bright attacking the aristocracy of England and the Corn Laws on behalf of a laissez-faire system. There's one passage which I cannot forbear from quoting, since I do have the book out, and it's on a somewhat different subject. He was really very fine in a number of areas. The governor of New York State, for instance, had decreed Thanksgiving Day, and he wrote an essay, an editorial, totally outraged. Where does the state authority come off telling us what day we're going to thank God for the blessings he has given us? Who is he to tell us which day we should do it on? So kind of hardcore. And in this essay, he's dealing with the proposal to keep out foreign paupers. There were people who wanted to restrict immigration in those days, and the way they did it, they said, before they can come into this country, they have to have money, because otherwise they're going to get on relief. And he says, no, because that's simply a way of keeping out people who don't have money now, but want to come into the country to start working and do what everybody else has done in America. He says, we are not obliged to open our poor houses to those who are unable to work among these foreigners. The care of those really disqualified by nature or accident from taking care of themselves should in any case be left to voluntary charity, even paupers in our own country, not to that wretched system of compulsory charity which poor laws enjoin. But with regard to these poor creatures who are flocking to our country as the boasted asylum of the oppressed of all the world, we ought to welcome them hither, not meet them with scowls. You might say that these passages from Leggett are being offered as a memorial for the 18 Mexicans whose blood is on the hands of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. For our part, we open our arms to them and embrace them as brothers, for are they not part of the great family of man? It is a violation of the plainest principles of morals. It is a sin against the most universal precepts of religion to harden our hearts against these men and seek to expel them from a land which they have as much right to tread as we who assume such a lofty position. If they are idle, let them starve. You might call that libertarian humanism. If they are vicious, let them be punished. But in God's name, as they bear God's image, let us not turn them away from a portion of that earth which was given by its maker to all mankind. Open the gates to all peaceful and productive people. This is the cosmopolitan feeling. This is the humanitarian feeling of the liberalism of the time. And you can see how much it goes against the grain of state authority, even into our own day. So, the liberals of the time made bad enemies, and they made powerful enemies among the established institutions and the powers that were at the time. And these enemies gradually began to evolve a counter-ideology, a counter-philosophy to liberalism. It eventually came to be known as conservatism. Conservatism is thus a reactionary philosophy. That is, it arose in reaction against liberalism and against the American and French revolutions and the revolutionary movement of the time. There were various conservative writers. The most famous is, in fact, the most liberal, because he was an Englishman, Edmund Burke, and really, in the England of his time, he was a Whig, a supporter of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. In fact, even defended the American colonies during the War of Independence. So although he was a conservative by the time of the French Revolution, he was not nearly as reactionary, one might say, as the European writers, especially the French writers like de Maistre and Bonald, and others that could be mentioned, in Germany especially. And these conservative writers altogether began to evolve a critique of liberalism and a critique of the new individualistic and capitalist manufacturing society that was coming into existence. You see, they were the spokesmen for the aristocratic classes, for the established churches, for the royal ruling houses, and they saw that what was coming into existence, what was coming into being, was something that threatened them very deeply, threatened them centrally. And in their writings, you can note many of the arguments against the new liberal order and against capitalism that never afterwards died. They believed that liberalism led to a heartless egoism and a trampling on all the weak and poor people in society, with only the strong winning. They believed that a liberal economic order was chaotic. It was anarchic. There was no central direction. Everybody going off in his own direction, seeking his own self-interest. There was no coordination to such an order. It would lead eventually to the rule of the great capitalists through the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. And in the meantime, it destroyed not only all high culture, but all standards of culture altogether. It debased society. It made society common, materialistic. The conservatives saw the market as an object of hatred. It was an engine of ceaseless change in their view. Here's a quotation from another contemporary conservative, George Will. Good, good, very good. My second favorite person. My first favorite is Pol Pot. Will says that, see, he doesn't like the fact that in the United States, sometimes the free market is described as the essence of conservatism. Free enterprise, the belief in free enterprise, that's conservatism. He's smarter than that. He knows about this older and more authentic conservative tradition. He says conservatism often has been inarticulate about what to conserve other than free enterprise, in quotations and ironic quotes, which is institutionalized restlessness, an engine of perpetual change. But to govern is to choose one social outcome over others, to impose a collective will on processes of change. This is really very genuine, authentic, original conservatism. I mean, you have to hand that to Will. Conservatism that does not extend beyond reverence for enterprise is unphilosophic, has little to do with government, and conserves little. Politics should be citizens expressing themselves as a people, a community of shared values, rather than as merely a collection of competing private interests inhabiting the same country. And that was the conservative argument, to a large extent. Liberalism bred individualism, capitalism, it sprang community apart, and these were the arguments invented by conservatives that were there when the socialist movement comes into existence and the socialists take over those arguments. Liberalism has always had two enemies, conservatism and socialism, except that conservatism was there first. This can be seen, for instance, in another early conservative in England, a man named Robert Southey, who was the poet laureate. By the way, you know that now in America we have poet laureates, right? It's another great advance. We were always so far behind the Europeans in those things. Really, at last we're beginning to catch up a little bit. Of course, every government knows what the function of honors of that kind is. Richelieu knew what it meant to set up the Académie Française. Napoleon knew what it meant to set up the Legion of Honor. The English kings knew what it meant to set up the knighthoods and every other honor they give out. What does it mean? It means that the talented and ambitious people in society will now aim for that as the culminating honor of their life. Okay? And what does that mean? It means that you better keep your record very clean. If you want to be poet laureate someday, it probably will pay not to write some poem about how it's really good to hang a king every once in a while. That's going to count very much against your record. So it's a way of keeping people in line. It's a way of the government exercising this kind of influence, this kind of impact on the culture of society. And now we're beginning to get this too, aside from the national endowments for the arts and for the humanities and for democracy now also. More and more the government taking over the mind, the culture of society. Well, Robert Southey wrote an attack on the Industrial Revolution from a conservative point of view. And he said, and this is about the late 1820s, what all the conservatives at the time were saying. You liberal manufacturers, you who want to take power away from us and set up this new liberal order, you better look to see how you have turned working people into the new slaves. You worry about slaves in America, you worry about slaves in the West Indies, but you don't worry about the slaves in your own cotton textile factories. Those are the new slaves, the terrible things that you do to them, the way that you've destroyed the once proud and free British working class. Does this sound like socialism to you? Does that sound like socialistic arguments? The arguments were invented by Tories. The arguments were invented by Tory journalists in London, by Tory writers like Southey, by Tory aristocrats like the Earl of Shaftesbury, who owned, I don't know, something estates the size of Connecticut, but hated the new factories, tried in every way possible to interfere with freedom of contract in the factories. Now, Southey wrote a famous attack in a book called Colloquies of Sir Thomas More. And he was attacked by a great liberal of the time, Thomas Babington Macaulay. Macaulay was a great historian. And it's an interesting fact, speaking of history, that many people really have gotten their idea of politics more often from history than from philosophy or economics or any other field. Somehow they gather views, historical interpretations, which then become determining in their mind for their political ideas. You might check that out for yourself and see how many of your own ideas really, if you had to defend them one way or another, the first thing that you bring up is some historical examples that allegedly prove the position. But Macaulay Macaulay was a very clever man. He had eidetic imagery, photographic memory, which is very helpful for a historian. Once, when he was crossing the Irish Sea on the way to Dublin, his books didn't show up in time, so he had to go without any books on the sea voyage. And he just laid back in the deck chair and recited Milton's Paradise Lost to himself. And this is his attack on Southey and what's called Tory paternalism. If you've never come across that term, Tory paternalism. The idea that the working class has to be taken under the wing of some superior authority. They can't really see to their own interests. They're not fully independent human beings. And paternalism, of course, in every field. And this is how he attacks Southey. This conservative Southey conceives that the business of the magistrate is not merely to see that the persons and property of the people are secure from attack, but that he ought to be a jack of all trades, an architect, engineer, schoolmaster, merchant, theologian, a lady bountiful in every parish, a Paul Pry in every house, spying, eavesdropping, relieving, admonishing, spending our money for us and choosing our opinions for us. His principle is, if we understand it rightly, that no man can do anything so well for himself as his rulers, be they who they may, can do it for him, and that a government approaches nearer and nearer to perfection in proportion as it interferes more and more with the habits and notions of individuals. Southey also said, a people may be too rich, but a government cannot be so. And if that's not George Will, I mean, I don't know where, where he gets his ideas. So in this case of Southey, we see this very interesting fact that the conservatives bring up this argument which afterwards, ever afterwards, is going to be a standard argument against capitalism. Well, we tried laissez-faire capitalism at one time. And you know what happened? The damn Industrial Revolution happened, degrading working people. You might think to yourself, what picture comes into your mind when you hear Industrial Revolution, right? I don't want to hear from Randians about great factories and railroads and taggart lines spanning and so on. All the standard pictures really were set first by conservatives and then of course taken over and used very adroitly by the socialists. But the fact of the matter, now we don't have very much time to go into this, so all I can do is give you perhaps some bibliographical pointers. The fact of the matter is that almost nothing of that early attack on the Industrial Revolution remains standing now that modern scholarship has dealt with the issue. Almost nothing remains standing. First of all, even if we take the simplest case, what happened to the standard of living of working people in England during this period, roughly 1750 to 1850? Even if we take that simple question, statistical evidence seems to be that it rose slowly through this whole period. Okay, you can see that, for instance, in a book by N.F.R. Crafts, with a C, Crafts, British Economic Growth During the Industrial Revolution, Clarendon Press, Oxford, 1985. And the figures are there. If you want to see the debate, by the way, both sides of the debate given, there's a book by Arthur Taylor called The Standard of Living in England During the Industrial Revolution. And it's an anthology, and he presents debates, arguments on both sides. So you can see what people say. But this is, on that question, pretty much now the established position. But that's not the whole story by any means. What other factors were working at the time to depress wages and the standard of living lower than they had to be? And there, the obvious factor is the war. England was at war for a whole generation. And it was the greatest, most expensive war in world history up until that time. It was the war against the French Revolution and against Napoleon. At the end of the war, England had a public debt that was greater than all the public debts in the world put together. Right in the middle, from 1793 to 1815, right in the middle of this period of industrialization, all of this tremendous capital was being wasted on the war. And this is the position that especially Jeffrey Williamson of Harvard University takes. There's an interesting article in the Journal of Economic History of 1984. Why was British growth so slow during the Industrial Revolution? The main reason, he says, was the war. There were other factors that lowered the standard of living of working people. Once the war was over, the big windfall profits that the landlords had gotten began to fall when there was a freer importation now of grain into England. Obviously, it was during the war, it was difficult to get food in. Now it was easier, and in order to maintain their profits from before, they put in a series of high tariffs on grain called the Corn Laws. This raised the price of cereals at a time when bread, literally bread, was the single most important item in the budget of working families. So the super added a tremendous tariff, in this way depressed standard, and also regressive, representing a transfer from the relatively poor working people, large consumers of grains, to the relatively rich, the aristocrats and landowners. This is still not the whole story. We have to find out what the comparison was between the standard of living of working people even in the Industrial Revolution, low as it is by our standards, and what it was before the Industrial Revolution, to see whether it represented a decline or a deterioration. I mean, that's just logical, isn't it? If we don't know anything about what it was like before, we can't make a comparison. And more research is now being done into economic history before the Industrial Revolution, into the 18th century in particular. And here's a quotation from Neil McKendrick, of Cambridge in England. The birth of the consumer society. The myth of the Garden of Eden before the Industrial Revolution has been shaken too by our increasing appreciation of the texture of poverty in the pre-industrial world, the kind of thing I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture last time. When we read, now he's quoting Bradell, that the poor in the towns and countryside lived in almost complete deprivation. You know, we have inventories of the things that they left when they died. They bother to mention broken plates, broken saucers, a chair with 3 legs or 2 legs. They bother to mention all of this trivial, and it's in a way so pathetic. But that was the lot and condition of working people through all of history. When we read that the poor in the towns and the countryside lived in almost complete deprivation, or that the average man's income was so low that even a poor man's diet absorbed 60 to 80% of that income in good times, after having bought their food, the mass of the people had little left for their wants, no matter how elementary they were. In pre-industrial Europe, the purchase of a garment or the cloth for a garment remained a luxury the common people could afford but few times in their lives. He says elsewhere, what did the Industrial Revolution mean? It meant that to enjoy the act of purchase was no longer seen as the prerogative of the rich. When we hear that even the clothes of plague victims were eagerly sought by their relatives, and when we learn of the low expectation of life, the high infant mortality, the sickness which threaded their lives, the poor diet and few comforts they had to sustain them, then the gains of the Industrial Revolution become more impressive. In my view, liberalism and capitalism, so far from having anything to apologize for, quite the contrary. Liberalism was never the tissue of fantasies of the socialist visionaries of the mid-19th century, Marx above all. It was the real life doctrine that was put into effect and that served the interests of the common people. That's why someone like Mises has all the self-confidence in the world when you read his writings and when he talks about these issues. Because in his view and in his estimation, he's arguing for the philosophy and for the system that was the salvation of the masses of working people. It was not rhetoric, it wasn't slogans, it was what really worked. Let me finally now deal with that point, because the final point is, what would have happened if there had been no Industrial Revolution? Okay, don't worry, no dirty smokestacks, no pollution, no sweatshops, none of this awful stuff, no factories. Well, England was going through a population explosion, which then hit one after another the other European countries. As one of the historians of the Industrial Revolution on our side, R.M. Hartwell at the University of Chicago in Virginia, says, if you want to see a country that goes through goes through a population explosion without an Industrial Revolution, then go to Calcutta. I received in the mail from Longman, who's a reputable publisher, a book. Professors get books. These are these $22 paperbacks, right? And they get them free in the mail because then they can force you to buy them, and the manufacturer makes millions of dollars. So it doesn't matter then that they just send out books free to professors. But it's by a reputable and respected authority, Eric J. Evans, a senior lecturer in history at the University of Lancaster, called The Forging of the Modern State, Early Industrial Britain, 1783 to 1870. And this is a short quotation from this book. He's not any great fan of the Industrial Revolution. He's no great apologist. He thinks that the pollution problem was very, very bad. He doesn't understand that there are market solutions for that. If anybody had thought of them at the time, that it wasn't anything intrinsically in the market that led to the pollution. But nonetheless, he's no total optimist, let's say. But this is his conclusion. It is relevant to mention a counterfactual point. What would have happened to Britain's teeming population had industrial growth not rescued it from a Malthusian poverty trap? It is difficult to see how a check on an even more catastrophic scale than the Irish famine of 1845 to 47 could have been avoided. And to this not inconsiderable extent, the Industrial Revolution brought the benefit of permitting a much larger population to survive and in the long term thrive. As far as I'm concerned, that settles the issue. There is no argument over the Industrial Revolution anymore, if that's correct. Because what you're talking about is salvation of the lives of millions upon millions of the British working class through the new productivity that the industrialization brought about. And the people who are the foolish, the deeply foolish people who are the enemies of industrialization were people who, they didn't know it, unintentionally to be sure, were the grave diggers, were the would-be grave diggers of the British working class. So that this is the outcome, in my view, of the debate, started by the conservatives. Now, to turn our attention to the other great enemies of the classical liberals, they at least were not as unrealistic, as inherently foolish as the conservatives were with their attack on industrialism. This has to be one of the greatest panegyrics, one of the greatest hymns of praise of capitalism ever written. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the capitalists, capitalism, made their way into socialist doctrine. Oh, you can see this with the earlier so-called utopian socialists, the followers of Saint-Simon. Who openly take arguments from reactionaries like de Maistre. One thing, however, that seems clear at the end of the, getting close now to the end of the 20th century, this socialism, this secular religion that started close to 200 years ago. Okay, as Marx says in Capital, the life process of society, which is based on the process of material production, does not strip off its mystical veil until it is treated as production by freely associated men and is consciously regulated by them in accordance with a settled plan. Okay, the abolition of commodity production, that is, the abolition of the market, the abolition of money, and finally the abolition of the division of labor itself. These are all what is meant by socialism. This was the dream. This was the dream. No more market, everything consciously planned and determined. And not by state bureaucracy either, but by freely associated producers. This was the dream. What's left of this dream? Who believes this anymore? Who believes that this is feasible or desirable? From the New York Times of May 9th, a Soviet magazine published an article this week warning that efforts to introduce elements of a free market into the Soviet Union's planned economy were bound to fail, and saying the country would have to choose between complete economic freedom and central control. This was an article by an economist, a woman named Larisa Popkova, in the May issue of Novy Mir. It's either plan or market, either directive or competition. That sounds like Mises' planning for freedom. You don't find things like that in the New York Times. You only find them in the Times, quoted from Novy Mir. Where there is socialism, she writes, there is no place for markets and liberal spirit. And I repeat, there cannot be. It is my conviction that this is also true about today's attempt to tune the national economy to the frequency of the consumer. So, that can't be done even within the framework of socialism. You have to have a total market economy. Why is it that people, we thought China was a tremendous exception. Here now in the Soviet Union itself. Why is it that people are coming to this conclusion? Why is it that the socialist revolution in Algeria is over and they're looking now for foreign investment? In Mozambique, they're beginning to talk about bringing in elements of Marxism, all these countries that are supposed to have been conquered for socialism. Is it out of lack of will? Somehow they were subverted by the CIA? Or is it that somehow the reality has caught up with them? That, in fact, the Marxist dream was that. And it's not what, anything that can be used for people to survive. And now in the Soviet Union itself, it may be indeed that we'll see great changes, unexpected changes. But then Robert Conquest has an article. I'll be mentioning him on Thursday. He's a fine British historian of the Soviet Union, especially of Stalinism. Says that as he sees it, the mood in the Soviet Union today resembles nothing so much as France in the 1780s. Very interesting. Well, I don't know. Sometimes I'm personally very pessimistic. You see, it doesn't seem as if there's any end to human gullibility. You understand that classical liberalism, understood properly, has no quarrel with tradition or with religion per se. It can have no quarrel, since classical liberalism affirms everything that happens in the voluntary sector of society and perfectly understands the value of tradition. Sometimes conservatives say classical liberals hate tradition. What could that mean? Tradition is speaking the English language, for instance. Tradition is dining on fine cuisine, as we did this evening. Tradition makes up the greater part of everybody's life. The traditions of the classical liberalism opposes are the traditions that are founded on coercion and force. Just as the religious practices that classical liberalism opposes, and nothing that have to do with religion itself. As a matter of fact, as time went on, more and more classical liberals, in the 18th century they tended to be, or many of them tended to be anti-religious per se. But in the 19th century, more and more said, no, look, this looks as if it has a very valuable role to play in the life of man, religion, as long as it is separated from the state. As long as we abide by the American doctrine, by the American maxim, that the Americans had the genius to put into the very first words of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. No law. That's it. That's it. That is now going to be totally in the voluntary sector of society. And as long as that happens, you can have religious peace, and religion can fulfill many important, valuable functions in society. So the conservatives are wrong about that. Classical liberalism is not anti-tradition, it is not anti-religion, it is against forced tradition and forced religious values. And sometimes when you're pessimistic, you know, it looks as if, I mean, look, what is this crazy stuff now? Khomeini, the Muslim world maybe going over to Muslim Islamic fundamentalism, hundreds of millions of people. Where did this come from? Is the human race so given to fanaticism? And as far as collectivism goes, sometimes I sort of feel that the truth of the matter lies. How many people have read this really fabulous, terrific novel by Ira Levin called This Perfect Day? Okay. Did you enjoy that book? Yes. Do yourself a favor, okay? I don't have any copies that I'm selling, so forget that. There's nothing like that. Do yourself a favor. Buy this book, okay, called This Perfect Day by Ira Levin. He wrote Rosemary's Baby, Stepford Wives, Death Trap. Does he know how to tell a story? Huh? And this is his libertarian book. And I noticed in Barbara Brandon's book, she said he attended the NBI lectures for a year. And this is his libertarian book, This Perfect Day. And sometimes I feel, yeah, that's the way the world is going to be. Every third person is going to be a psychotherapist. The whole population is going to be drugged. The worst words will be fight, attack, anything having to do with competition and so on, and rivalry of any kind. They'll be brainwashed out of the human race. That's the way it's going to be. Computers, state-run computers running everything. So that, in my pessimistic view, is where I tend. But there really wouldn't be any point in having this conference if most of us felt that way most of the time, and I don't really feel that way most of the time. It occurs to me, mentioning this technology, how are they going to... it's just going to be impossible to have one narrow cultural and moral line that's somehow incumbent on the whole human race, or vast portions of it. It's not going to work. It's going to be impossible to enforce. And as for Sovietism, the 21st century is going to find it necessarily much different. Central economic planning was a notion that came out of the 19th century. You know, you could say that the hammer and sickle really are very symbolic, deeply symbolic of socialism and central economic planning, right? Not the laser, not the computer, right? Not the Xerox machine, not the new electronic revolution. The hammer and the sickle. Well, yes. And the abacus you can throw in too. That system is not going to work very much longer. It has to be markets. In some form or another, there has to be markets. And once you talk about markets, this Marxist idea of man controlling his destiny, everything planned out to the last iota, and that being true, human dignity, that vanishes. There's nothing to it. So what is it about? I mean, so who believes that somehow the world is going to be made into some glorious paradise if we nationalize some industry? Nobody believes that anymore. They were able to believe that in the 19th century. It's clearly nothing. There's nothing to it. So the 21st century, I think, will have to be probably more than the 19th century, the century of liberalism and of capitalism, if we preserve peace. If war comes and if serious war comes and all bets are off, the state is going to come in again in a vengeance. Well, that's my overview of the relationship between liberalism and its two main enemies, conservatism and socialism, up until the present time. There are more details I guess I could bring up, but since we didn't get very much time for discussion this morning, and since you perhaps have some points both from this morning and from this evening that you'd like to bring up, why don't we end here and we can start our discussion. Yes?
Well, Ralph, if you really want to be pessimistic...
You got some news for me?
Well, maybe it'll go like this. Maybe after the Russians are free, then they'll bury us.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say that because Russia has always been a very imperialistic country. And one thing that has probably cramped their imperialistic style is their low economic performance. If they turn that to be a very productive society, you know, it's very big. It covers a large part of the globe. They could be... England was basically a capitalist society and it was imperialistic, and they really threw their weight around. Yes?
Along the same line, don't you think, or I think, I'll put words in your mouth, that this communist Marxism, Soviet communism, is just the old Russian imperialism. They got a new gimmick that they can sell to people, and it isn't the Cossacks coming charging.
Right.
They just come in a little nicer, and there they are.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are certainly continuities between Tsarist foreign policy and ambitions of the Soviet, and also, of course, continuities in the domestic society. Russia always had a heavily state-oriented economy. The Tsarist government was by far the largest landowner, by far the largest industrialist, by far the largest coal miner, and so on in Russia before the Soviet takeover. So that there are continuities. But of course, someone like Solzhenitsyn wants to say that there are deep dichotomies also. And ideology and religion would be one of them. Of course, I think they're probably both, but I don't know if that tells us very much about what it's likely to be in the future. Not that this is a study in futurology, but yes.
Throughout the discussion, you keep referring to liberalism. Of course, I think we know what we mean. Is there some way that we can talk to other people who are not members of this subgroup, and it's a term we can use to be understood?
Well, do you have any suggestions yourself?
No.
No, you see, I don't think that there is. We could say classical liberalism. I don't think that we should say conservatism because it gives a wrong slant to our point of view. Will is right. We favor the kind of society which is the most dynamic, innovative, changing, evolving society that ever existed. All of the great changes have occurred in basically liberal society. For centuries after centuries, the great man in his book, The Constitution of Liberty, suggests the term old Whig, which is, I think, a very good example of how in touch Hayek is with the point of view of the average American, let's say. The libertarian, I don't know, it sounds, it's now associated with this party. It sounds a little bit made up. I prefer classical liberal. I mean, the very fact that you have to explain then brings you right away into the middle of your argument, right? What do you mean classical? What is classical? Well, classical liberal.
People have time to listen to you.
Well, I mean, what do we? Yeah, if the guy is rushing somewhere, why are you getting into a discussion with him to begin with? But does anybody want to speak to that? Anybody have any ideas as far as terminology goes? I mean, I think that we've been through all the possibilities. Ashwin?
No, I wanted another question.
Another question. Well, there was a hand up of David. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's a somewhat different subject. A lot of conservatives talk about how one of the tasks of conservatives today, they generally say this sort of quietly, but in their own publications, is repealing the Enlightenment. I think that's a very vivid phrase.
Sure is.
I wonder if you have any comments on sort of why modern conservatives, what they would mean by that and what that tells us.
That's disgusting.
Hold on.
Well, you know, because look, it's not that there is any question about these facts. The facts that I gave you in the beginning of my talk yesterday. What does that mean? Now, bringing back the ghettos for Jews? I wonder what Mr. Podhoretz would think about that. Before the Enlightenment had done its work, what the Enlightenment was about, you might say, were things like the trial and judicial murder of Jean Calas. I mean, you know, these conservatives probably, if they've heard of it, prefer not to think about it. This is a very famous case. Jean Calas was a dweller, an inhabitant of Toulouse in the south of France, and Protestant, barely tolerated, I mean legally not tolerated. All Protestants were bastards, were born out of wedlock because only Catholic marriages were recognized in law. There was no civil marriage. And his son was heard to express an interest in becoming a Catholic. Well, one day the son is found hanged. And everyone in this town, and we're not talking about some desolate, some godforsaken part of the Balkans, we're talking about one of the great cities of France, is convinced that Calas murdered his son to prevent him from becoming a Catholic, because that's the way Protestant parents are. They don't have feelings like you and I. They don't. They're easily capable of doing things like that, just as Jews were capable of killing Gentile babies, and you know the blood libel. The blood of Gentile babies was necessary to be mixed with matzah meal. I don't know whether Manischewitz or which particular brand, to be used in the Passover festival. People were murdered, were killed by crowds, by mobs on this basis. This is what you had before Enlightenment. So Calas was taken, tried, broken on the rack, and died for the murder of his son. This is what outraged Voltaire. He said, "De cause l'infâme," crush the infamous thing, the political power of the Catholic Church. And it was really a rather decent thing. He spent a lot of time, wrote a lot of people, he knew everybody. The Parliament of Paris finally at least rehabilitated the name of Jean Calas. He was dead, but at least he didn't go down in history as the murderer of his own kid. That's the way it was before Enlightenment. It was what Cromwell's soldiers did to the Irish because they performed the Mass, this terrible blasphemy, this mockery. It's like monkeys prancing around a church and making fun of Jesus Christ, the Savior of us all, this Catholic Mass. And therefore, since we're so right about it, we have the right to go and exterminate the Irish Catholics. That's what it was like before Enlightenment. What it was like, you know who repealed the Enlightenment? The fascists. Hitler repealed the Enlightenment. And he thought it was, and it was said that it was a repeal of the Enlightenment. They were going back on this mistake that had been made in Western history. This idea of individual rights. What else do you want to say, Dave?
That's a great answer.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the growth of classical liberal ideas.
Could you speak a little louder?
Yes,
so that you can be heard back there.
You mentioned the growth of classical liberal ideas in the development of the Industrial Revolution. For very obvious and colorful reasons, I'm not an Anglophile, but to me the Industrial Revolution always symbolized the British Revolution, the sort of British means of effecting social change. One of the things which I didn't see you discuss was the fact that the Industrial Revolution involved a change in the method and organization of production, and how that affected the growth and spread of classical liberal ideas. The two trains of thought that basically it would seem to me which would open up is one, it would take away the religious dependence on land and labor as being the source of all value, and it would introduce another factor of production in terms of capital. And second, the change in the method in the organization of production would involve the rise of a new class to displace the old one.
Well, there were different new classes came into existence. There's no doubt about that. You're right, of course. I didn't go into any details about the factory system and the new organization of production. It tended to, and we were talking about the British example. That's the one that's used as a test. And when they talk about, and I think I mentioned a number of times really, the question is what happened to the condition of life of the working classes. This change occurred. This new manufacturing system came into existence in those areas of England which were not controlled by the old system, that were not controlled by the old guilds, that were in newer, unincorporated areas, perhaps, generally in the north and in the west of England. And the old southern area tended to be somewhat backward. So it's up there that there's something new in the world came into existence for the first time, did change things. Land, of course, almost by definition, was relatively now diminished in importance, but nonetheless, in fact, the Industrial Revolution was preceded by a revolution in agriculture that tended to increase productivity in that field, and they went hand in hand in the 19th century. Clearly, the new masses of workers were to a large extent fed by the new productivity of the land in their own countries, besides buying food from the outside as well. But productivity in England, Germany, France, everywhere increased in the 19th century to feed these new masses. You know, when you see, revert to that for a minute, when you see that as the problem, this population explosion and how to deal with it, was it going to be dealt with in Irish terms? You know what that meant? Ireland had twice as many people in the middle of the 19th century as it does today. It had a population of about 8 million. And it never recovered from the famine. A couple of million died, a couple of million left. When you see it in those terms, if that was the alternative facing Europe, and industrialization was the way that Western civilization coped with this crisis, then it puts things in a very different light. It puts liberalism into a different light, and it puts also socialism into a different light. Socialism as the harping, well, come on, hurry up, make things better, hurry up and do, and make. They had no idea how to make things better. Sure, we want to make things better. And the way we have of making things better is capital accumulation, more efficient capital markets, more inventiveness to be encouraged by higher profits, free trade. That's the way we have to make things better. That's what the liberals were proposing. And that is, in the long run, essentially what worked. These masses could not be supported by some kind of redistribution of wealth. There wasn't that much wealth at any given time to begin with. They couldn't be supported by the welfare state. It was a question of bare survival, let alone anything in addition to that. And the question of survival, the gradual incorporation and integration of the working class, the specter of pauperization. Marx talks about that. He understands that that's a problem. He doesn't understand where it's coming from or what the real solution could be. But the specter of the pauperization of the working class of England and of Europe in the mid-19th century was a very real one. That didn't happen, it didn't happen, and it did not happen for reasons that classical liberal economists can explain to you. The sort of things that were supposed to work, worked. The working class finally had a chance to survive, and then gradually, as time went on, increased in their standard of living. So by the end of the 19th century, new arguments against capitalism had to be invented. Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, said that capitalism stands its trial before its judges, the intellectuals, who already have the sentence of death in their pocket. It's only a question of what charge. It's only a question of what charge that capitalism is going to be found guilty of. And it couldn't be found guilty of the increased pauperization of the working class. So by the end of the 19th century, new charges had to be brought in. Capitalism causes imperialism and war. Or capitalism causes destruction. Now, capitalism causes destruction of the environment. Capitalism undermines the family, or capitalism keeps this terrible nuclear family together, whatever side you're on that one. Capitalism brings about promiscuity, as the Soviets say, or capitalism leads to repression of sexuality, as Marxo-Freudians say. Marxo-Freudianism, that has to be one of my favorite things, too. I'm not getting paid for an extra lecture here. Yes?
Has there been an attempt to relate classical liberalism or conservatism to different psychological profiles of people who believe in different views, socialism as well?
What's your guess as to the psychological profile of a classical liberal? I mean, just to judge from Roy and myself, whom you've seen today. No, that really would be quite unfair. I think you should wait until at least until the end of...
There's a book by Doris Baker called Man in the Trap, based on the theory of Wilhelm Reich. That's the only thing I've ever seen.
Okay. Nathan will explain it all to you in much greater detail later.
No, I won't.
No? Sorry. I don't really know very much about that. I'm sorry.
I have a question about the relationship between the Romantics, who were against the Enlightenment back in the early 19th century, and the environmentalists today.
That's interesting. You want to say something about that yourself? You seem to have some ideas.
No, well, I think there's an anti-religious... conservatives basically are saying that capitalism destroys religious authority, and the Romantics, of course, wanted to bring it back. They were the medievalists. They had something called the Edgington Tournament, where a bunch of English aristocrats, I think this was in 1870, they all dressed up in medieval costumes and thrashed each other about. And and I think the environmentalists are basically took up where the English aristocrats left off.
Right, there's a kind of mystique of the purity of nature, of pristine, virginal nature, and how man's rationality and purposive activity has destroyed that early purity. On the other hand, there were some romantics who, like Shelley, who tended to be radical and revolutionary.
Well, do you remember Shelley's line, where every prospect pleases and only man is vile?
Yeah.
That's
also
a very good environmentalist slogan.
Yeah. But on the other hand, let's not. There are classical liberals and classical liberal economists also concerned about the environment in some general sense, about whatever, endangered species, for instance. And it's interesting. Maybe in some discussion groups it'll come up. There are people who know a lot more about this than I do, but there are market solutions to a lot of these questions. Someone was telling us about a guy in Oregon who set up his, does anybody remember this? The IHS, well, Joe was mentioning it, right, but I think Sterling from Texas had some of the details. A man in Oregon is just naturally, I mean, this was his interest, concerned about endangered species, and set up his farm and the area into it that he owned of land into some kind of wild game preserve, and dozens of new species came in. And then you can imagine the kind of trouble he got in with the Environmental Protection Agency, because then he had many new species on his land, and many of the regulations came into play. At the end, he would do virtually nothing with his own land, not use it for anything at all, because he had brought in all of these new species that he had felt to be endangered. So it's not a question of being anti-environmentalist. I think that they have many important concerns with pollution and with nature in general. But I think that you're right. This metaphysical attitude of being against human activity as some kind of stain of pure nature is something very insidious. Nathan.
Would you advocate free trade even with states where a lot of the goods that you would trade with have been produced to some degree, and not totally by some sort of slave labor out of Russia?
Well, what do you say about English manufacturers who imported cotton in the 19th century from the United States? I mean, they imported cotton that was literally grown by people called slaves. Was that, do you think that was improper?
Why not take a long-term look, like the view that eventually, if you have free trade and greater wealth and so forth, maybe they'll come around, or you just isolate them?
That was on their mind.
Sure, but I'm asking you what would be on your mind?
Well, see, I wonder, people, the reason I bring that up is that sometimes people do talk about the Soviet Union in those terms, and I guess there's some kind of case to be made out, but does anybody believe that it was improper for the rest of the world to trade with the American South? Right up until the emancipation took place? Does anybody believe that all of these it was every manufacturer virtually and businessman in Europe did some trading with the American South? Does anybody really believe that was improper because the goods had been produced by slaves? Was it improper for the Northerners to buy things from the American South? Do you think?
Well, I mean, yeah, I would have problems with buying something from somebody I knew produced by their slaves, yeah.
Well, I guess it just didn't occur to anybody, or to very few people, just as it doesn't today. Yeah. Does somebody want to talk to this? Because I think it's an interesting point, but I don't know if I have very much to say about it. I see her, yes.
Take a look at countries though, like South Korea, who's one of them non-failed say we should ban trade with countries that maybe don't even have slave labor, they deny the same working conditions that the United States have. We have to look at it, kind of what you're saying, long term, because those countries, because they have a capitalist system, because they're outside the United States, they move to better conditions quicker than countries that don't. You know, South Korea now is having a call for more democratic reform. But we said we did not trade with them because they don't practice the same United States standards. They would never come out of it.
Well, but I don't think Nathan was talking about necessarily about a regime like South Korea, which mainly has political repression. I think you were talking more about a situation where the workers themselves are in a condition that could be considered some form of servitude. And that's not really the case. I mean, what according to our standards, of course, is sweated labor in the factories of South Korea. According to their standards, and from what they've known, it's like the Industrial Revolution again. It's like, by the way, maybe you should have mentioned it. You want to imagine the Industrial Revolution and the problems and the way of judging it. Who was this? Was it the cabinet officer who about a year ago was going around exposing sweatshops of illegal aliens in New York and San Francisco?
Matt Baldwin.
Right. And it got on the news. Something terrible how these illegal aliens are being treated and exploited by these by these American businessmen. Of course, what's missing there is asking them what they think about it. And of course, they came there because it's the best thing that's available to them. It's the reason that these Mexicans risked and gave their lives to come and work in America. So, that is not the case in South Korea. Any kind of form of servitude, although it could be argued that it is the case in socialist countries. I think that's how the argument is generally made.
Well, it's just that it depends on how you want to define it, but they feel, people in Congress define labor as anything less than anything with the United States. And that's how they make the argument, that's how they take the American Republic. They're saying, we're buying cars produced by slave labor, and that's how.
Oh, well, that's not what's meant here. As a matter of fact, the argument was made, or that sort of more or less came to a head in regard to the Soviet pipeline. The Soviet petroleum pipeline a few years ago that was being built to provide oil for Western Europe, which was, according to reports, being literally built by forced labor, by prison labor. And prison labor, presumably to a large extent, prisoners of conscience, and not simply common criminals, but all the people who are considered criminals in the Soviet Union, innocent protesters. And many people said there's a moral problem there of Europeans accepting that oil from this pipeline. David?
I think Nathan has raised an interesting point, and in some senses it's analogous to the question, should it be okay to receive stolen goods? Clearly, in a sense, the products made by Soviet workers are stolen goods when the government offers them for sale. If you're going to say that, presumably you think no American business should be allowed to trade with the American government, which has only stolen goods to offer. And it seems unlikely the American government would make a rule that no one can trade with. The problem that you're going to get into, though, if you do try to do that as a rule of international trade, is you're going to end up with no international trade at all. It will be used simply as a protectionist measure. So first we would cut off all trade from socialist countries. This is even in sort of the ideal sense of the way Nathan is talking about it. Well, then what about South Africa? It has a relatively capitalist system, but you can't really argue that black workers there are free to choose where they might work, what kind of business they go into. And then once you make that bridge, you're going to have all sorts of other countries that have some problems in the way that they produce things. So, as a practical matter, I really think you'd be taking the first step toward cutting off a lot of trade, even though we don't do that much trading with the actual communist countries.
Yes.
I would come to dispute that argument because the link which you're making is from saying that these people are being enslaved by the people with whom they're dealing, saying that they're being enslaved by someone, by their governments. And I think that there is a key difference there. The people in South Africa are clearly being injured by their government, but we're dealing in that case with a private industry which may very well be opposed to the government's apartheid policies, and in many cases is not an actual creator of it. So there is a significant line between the two cases.
Well, maybe the line is clear here, but I wouldn't know it being clear in Congress.
That's true.
I think further it's a collectivist argument to say that the government should stop an individual company from trading with another country. Period. I think you run into a very great danger if the government is going to set an individual private, in quotes, company's trading policies. We might keep moral indignation on the company, but not prohibit it from doing that trading.
Okay. Yes. Russ.
You've spoken of the hatred which intellectuals have displayed in the 19th and 20th century of capitalism and market order. You said they changed their reasons for hating it. But the hatred is there. Why do it? In your opinion, why do they hate it? The reason that you see, I suppose, is rationalizations or there's something there besides the reasons. And what is it?
It'd be hard to say. Mises has a little book about that, and other people have dealt with the psychological roots of anti-capitalism. It would be hard to say. There are obviously many factors.
What's your view?
Well, yeah, my view is that there are many factors. One that, well, okay, there's only one factor. You're happy, okay? But among those that maybe we shouldn't lose sight of, that sounds not very nice to bring up, is the question of envy. There's a question of envy.
Oh, envy.
There's an interesting book by Helmut Schirk. This German sociologist. Do you know that book too? Would you care to perhaps give a lecture here? Shirk taught in America for many years, and I think the book actually was even written in English. And it's called Envy, and has some kind of subtitle. Very interesting book. Shirk is a little more conservative, I would say, than libertarian, but he is a believer in the free market. And he says you can read any number of books on social psychology, on psychology altogether, on sociology, and they don't deal with this basic human emotion of envy. It's sort of down an Orwellian memory hole. Nobody wants to talk about envy. Why? Because it's really very ugly. It's a very nasty emotion, envy. Envy is the only one of the cardinal sins that has no degree of acceptability or value, right? I mean, sloth, for instance, take something that comes to mind, has a degree of restfulness, right? I mean, the desire to rest, that's valuable, right? And sloth is simply too much of that. Well, envy is not the same sort of thing. Envy is destructive in every degree to which it appears. Envy simply wants to take something away from someone else because you don't have it, and would rather, even if you didn't have it, that he shouldn't have it. I mean, not just take it away from him to give it to you, but if you can't have it, then it should be destroyed for him too and spoiled for him too. Envy is like that kind of feeling is expressed by the intellectuals of the left wing of the British Labour Party, who admit that education will not necessarily be improved for people in public schools, the American use of public schools, if the British private schools are abolished, but at least those kids in the private schools won't have the superior education. Okay, that's envy. And envy comes up very often with intellectuals. They rationalize it in various ways. I, after all, am an intellectual. Look at this guy, some Korean, comes here, doesn't have a penny to his name, sets up a fruit and vegetable store, okay, and just because he works 20 hours a day and his family works. You see them in Manhattan now? Have you seen them in Manhattan? It's a new thing. They work all the time. The place is always open, 24 hours a day. And somebody's always fixing the fruits. The grapefruits are always being piled in different, more beautiful configurations. The place is spotless. It's bright, they obsequiously gush whenever you come in. So this Korean came here with not a penny. He's now making money, putting money in the bank. They're buying property. Here I am, an intellectual. I can deconstruct William Blake. That means nothing to you? And look, I don't own property. I don't make the kind of money that they make. Something basically wrong. Wow, the system. So that envy definitely there's no doubt that envy plays a role. Also, simple ignorance, simple lack of knowledge. They really think that the people who get on top in a market economy get on top because of the old boy network. They know somebody, you know. Competence certainly doesn't mean anything. You know, if we were the heads of IBM, then we would be able to make all those great salaries and so on, and IBM, of course, would be, you can imagine being the head of IBM. I mean, it boggles the mind. But they simply are ignorant about it. They think that there is no such thing as business talent, there's no such thing as entrepreneurial sense. These are all foreign concepts to them. There's very much of the Mandarin spirit, you know? That the way that you properly make your way in life is by passing one examination after the other, right? You got your high school diploma, then you got your BA degree, then your MA, your PhD, and that's what should determine in a proper setting that the checks get bigger and bigger, okay? There's very little sense of entrepreneurial adventurousness among intellectuals for the most part. Okay, I think that this is about time for us, isn't it? Time for us to go to our discussion groups, whoever cares to, and we can continue this there. Thank you.